I need to get this out because I'm still processing what happened last weekend, and honestly, I don't know if I'm overreacting or if I should have seen this coming years ago. Some background first. I'm 34, married to Bryn for 6 years. We met in college, and back then she was different. Ambitious, sure, but not like this. I work in IT consulting, make decent money, nothing flashy, but we're comfortable. Bryn works in marketing and has always been image conscious, but lately it's gotten worse. Her family comes from money, not rich rich, but definitely upper middle class with all the expectations that come with it. Her sister Maeve married a surgeon, lives in one of those neighborhoods where everyone drives luxury cars and has lawn services. Her mother June never lets anyone forget that she thinks Bryn could have done better than me. I've dealt with the subtle digs for years. Comments about my Honda Civic when we're at family events, jokes about how I must be lucky Bryn isn't high maintenance. I figured it was just typical in-law stuff, and Bryn always seemed to have my back when it got too bad. Last Saturday changed everything. Maeve was hosting this dinner party for her husband's colleagues and their wives. Some medical conference thing. Bryn insisted we go, said it would be good networking for her business. I should have known something was off when she spent 2 hours getting ready and kept checking her phone. The evening started normal enough. Good food, boring conversation about golf and vacation homes. I was actually having an okay time talking to this older guy about his vintage car collection. Then Bryn started drinking wine. At first it was just her usual social drinking, but she kept refilling her glass. By the time we'd moved to the living room for dessert, she was definitely tipsy. That's when things went sideways. One of the wives was showing off some jewelry her husband bought her in Italy. Big diamonds. Looked expensive. Everyone was making the appropriate impressed noises. Then Bryn held up her wine glass and said something I'll never forget. She announced to the entire room that this is why women need to keep multiple options. She gestured at me sitting across the room and called me a pathetic loser who calls himself her husband. Said thank God Danny from her gym knows how to treat a woman properly. The room went dead quiet. I thought maybe I'd misheard, but then her sister started laughing. Maeve jumped in about how at least her ex could afford real jewelry, looking right at my wedding ring, which definitely wasn't platinum. June, her mother, decided to pile on too. She said Bryn should have married that doctor she dated before me because this one can't even fix his own car properly. I'd borrowed tools from my neighbor last month to change my brake pads, and apparently that made me incompetent. But it got worse. Some of Bryn's friends were there, and they started taking selfies, actually pulling out their phones and posing while one of them said she was posting about what happens when you settle for a broke boy. Then Bryn showed everyone her phone. She had some text messages from this Danny guy, apparently sending her money for shopping, $500. While she's waving this around, she points at me and announces that meanwhile, this one gives her homemade birthday cards. They all started laughing. Not uncomfortable social laughter, but genuine amusement at my expense. I sat there drinking my water and realized that every single person in that room saw me exactly the way Bryn did, as someone beneath them, someone worth mocking. Here's the thing though, I wasn't shocked. Sitting there listening to my wife tear me down in front of strangers, I realized I'd been seeing signs for months. The way she'd roll her eyes when I'd suggest staying in for dinner instead of going somewhere expensive. How she'd gotten secretive about her phone. The new clothes and bags that seemed beyond what her salary could handle. I'd been making excuses for her behavior, thinking it was just stress from work or pressure from her family. But hearing her call some gym guy who sends her money while mocking the cards I made because I thought they were more personal than store-bought ones, it clicked. This wasn't a bad night or too much wine. This was who she'd become. Or maybe who she'd always been, and I'd been too blind to see it. I finished my water, stood up, and told Bryn I was driving home. She barely looked up from her phone where she was showing off more messages from Danny. I heard June say something about me being dramatic as I walked out. The drive home gave me 2 hours to think, really think, about how many times she'd dismissed things that mattered to me, how she'd started comparing me to other men more frequently, how she'd stopped wearing her wedding ring some days, claiming it didn't match her outfits. When I got home, I did something I probably should have done months ago. I started looking at our finances. Really looking. Not just paying bills, but seeing where our money was going. Turns out Bryn's been spending way more than her salary would allow. Designer bags, expensive dinners with friends, a gym membership that costs more than some people's car payments. And none of it was coming out of our joint account. I called my brother Danny the next morning. Not Jim Danny, my actual brother who's a lawyer. Told him I needed to understand my options if my marriage was heading where I thought it was heading. He asked me one question that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said, if she's willing to humiliate you like that in public, what do you think she's saying about you in private? Bryn came home Sunday afternoon, hungover and acting like nothing happened. When I brought up the dinner party, she said I was being oversensitive and that everyone was just having fun. She actually used the word banter. I'm supposed to go to couples therapy with her next week. She booked it after I told her we needed to talk about our marriage. But honestly, I don't know if there's anything left to save. Part of me wonders if I should have said something at the party, stood up for myself instead of just leaving. But another part of me is glad I saw exactly what I was dealing with when she thought I wasn't fighting back. I've got a lot of decisions to make, and I'm not sure I trust her to be honest about what's really going on with this Danny situation or how long she's been checking out of our marriage. Anyone else ever had their spouse completely blindside them like this? Because I keep wondering what other conversations about me I haven't heard. Update 1. First off, thanks to everyone who commented on my original post. Some of you saw this coming from a mile away, and honestly, I wish I'd listened to my gut sooner. The couples therapy session was this past Tuesday. I went in hoping maybe we could work through this, that the dinner party was just her hitting rock bottom, and we could rebuild from there. I was wrong. Bryn spent the first 20 minutes explaining to the therapist how I was overreacting to what she called harmless jokes. She said her family has always teased each other, and I was being too sensitive. When I brought up the Danny situation, she got defensive immediately. She admitted to receiving money from him, but said it wasn't what I thought. According to her, Danny is just a friend from the gym who sometimes helps her out because he knows her family comes from money and she's used to a certain lifestyle. She said I should be grateful someone cares enough about her happiness to help when I can't provide what she needs. The therapist asked her how she thought that made me feel. Bryn looked directly at me and said maybe if I worked harder or had more ambition, she wouldn't need help from other people. She said she married me thinking I had potential, but I'd gotten comfortable and stopped trying to improve myself. That's when I realized this wasn't about the dinner party or even Danny. This was about her fundamental view of who I am as a person. She sees me as a project that failed, someone who's holding her back from the life she thinks she deserves. I asked her directly if she wanted to be married to me, not the version of me she hoped I'd become, but me as I am right now. She couldn't answer, just sat there looking at her hands. The therapist tried to redirect, but I was done. I told Bryn I'd heard enough and that we'd finish this conversation at home. The drive back was silent, but once we got to the house, everything came out. She started crying and saying she never meant to hurt me, that the pressure from her family to maintain appearances had been getting to her. She said Danny was just someone who understood what it was like to have nice things and not have to worry about money all the time. I asked her how long this had been going on. She said they'd been talking for about 8 months. 8 months of her complaining to another man about our marriage, our finances, and apparently about me specifically. She swore they'd never been physical, just talked, and sometimes he'd send her money for things she wanted but couldn't afford. She said it made her feel valued in a way she hadn't felt in our relationship for a long time. I asked to see their messages. All of them. She hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know, but eventually handed over her phone. Reading through months of conversations between my wife and this guy was brutal, not because they were sexual, but because of how she talked about our life together. She called our house small and embarrassing. She said I was content with mediocrity and didn't understand her need for better things. She complained about my car, my clothes, even the restaurants I'd take her to for date nights. But what really got to me was seeing her thank him repeatedly for understanding her in ways I apparently never could. She told him she felt trapped in a life that was beneath her potential. She said she'd married too young and settled for security instead of waiting for someone who could match her ambitions. The money transfers were constant. Not just the $500 she'd bragged about at the party, but regular payments. Sometimes $50 for lunch somewhere fancy. Sometimes $300 for a designer bag. Over 8 months, he'd sent her thousands of dollars. When I asked her what she gave him in return, she said nothing physical, just friendship and someone to talk to. I asked if she thought this was fair to either of us. She said life isn't fair, and at least someone appreciated her enough to invest in her happiness. That word, invest, stuck with me. She saw his money as an investment in her, which meant she saw me as what? A liability? I told her I needed space to think and that I'd be staying at my brother's place for a few days. She panicked then, saying we could work through this if I'd just try to understand her perspective. She said she'd stop talking to Danny if that's what I wanted, but she needed me to see that she had needs I wasn't meeting. I asked her what those needs were specifically. Better house, better car, more expensive vacations, designer clothes, things that cost money we don't have. When I pointed out that our combined income was actually pretty good for our age, she said it wasn't about the amount we made, but about the lifestyle it afforded us. She wanted me to get a higher-paying job, take on freelance work, maybe start my own consulting business, all things that would require me to work more hours and take on more stress so she could have the material things that would make her happy. I realized she'd been having this conversation with Danny for months, while letting me believe we were just having normal marriage struggles. Before I left for my brother's, I asked her one more question. If Danny was willing to leave his current situation and could provide the lifestyle she wanted, would she choose him over me? She said that wasn't fair to ask because it wasn't about choosing between people. It was about choosing between different kinds of lives. But she didn't say no. I've been at my brother's place for 3 days now. Bryn has been texting constantly, saying she misses me and wants to fix this. She's promised to cut contact with Danny and says we can go to more therapy sessions. Yesterday, she sent me a long message about how she realizes now that she was using Danny to fill an emotional gap in our marriage, instead of talking to me directly about what she needed. She said she's willing to work on being happy with what we have, instead of always wanting more. But here's the thing. I don't think I want to work on this anymore. Not because I can't forgive her for the emotional affair or the money situation, but because of how she sees me. She doesn't respect who I am. She loves who she thinks I could become if I just tried harder to be someone else. Someone with more money, more status, more ambition, to climb whatever ladder she thinks we should be climbing. My brother asked me if I thought she'd ever be satisfied, even if I did everything she wanted. Honestly, I don't think so. There would always be something else. Someone else's life to compare ours to, some new level of success or wealth to aspire to. I'm meeting with a lawyer on Friday, not because I've decided to file for divorce yet, but because I need to understand what my options are and how to protect myself if this marriage can't be saved. Part of me still loves her, but I'm starting to realize that might not be enough if she can't love me back the way I actually am. The hardest part is that she's not entirely wrong. Maybe I am too comfortable. Maybe I could push myself more professionally, but I don't want to spend my life trying to earn the respect and affection of someone who should already see my worth. Anyone else been in a situation where your partner loved your potential more than your reality? Because I'm struggling to see how you come back from that kind of fundamental incompatibility. Update 2. This week has been absolutely insane, and I need to vent to people who might actually understand what I'm dealing with. The lawyer meeting happened Friday, and everything that followed has been a complete circus. The consultation went better than expected. My brother recommended someone who handles family law, and she was straightforward about everything. Turns out the money Danny sent to Bryn could actually be considered a problem in divorce proceedings, especially since it went toward personal expenses while we have joint debts. She said courts don't look favorably on emotional affairs that involve financial support from outside parties. More importantly, she explained that I have more options than I realized. Since we don't have kids and most of our major assets were acquired after marriage, the process would be relatively straightforward if it came to that. She recommended I start documenting our separate finances and keeping records of any unusual expenses or income. I felt relieved leaving her office, like I finally had some control over my situation instead of just reacting to whatever Bryn decided to do next. That relief lasted exactly until Saturday morning. Bryn had been texting me constantly since Monday, but Saturday the messages changed. Instead of apologies and promises to fix things, she was angry. She said she'd talked to her family about our situation and they all agreed I was being unreasonable and throwing away our marriage over nothing. She showed up at my brother's place around noon. I was working on his motorcycle in the garage when she pulled up in her car. She looked like she'd been crying, but the second she started talking, I could tell this wasn't going to be a reconciliation conversation. She said she'd cut off all contact with Danny like I wanted, but now she felt like she was being punished for trying to fix her mistake. She said I was being stubborn and dramatic, that married couples work through problems instead of running away to lawyers and family members. I asked her if she understood why I went to a lawyer in the first place. She said it was because I wanted to hurt her the way she'd hurt me, which completely missed the point. I explained that I needed to understand my options because I wasn't sure our marriage could survive what had happened. She got defensive immediately. She said the money from Danny was never about replacing me or having an affair. It was about having someone who understood her needs without judging her for them. She said I'd made her feel guilty for wanting nice things or having ambitions beyond our current situation. That's when the real conversation started, and it lasted almost 2 hours right there in my brother's driveway. She told me her mother had been asking for months why she stayed married to someone with so little drive to succeed. June apparently had been comparing me unfavorably to Maeve's husband and suggesting that Bryn was wasting her potential. She said the pressure from her family to want more had been building for over a year. I asked her why she'd never talked to me about feeling pressured by her family. She said she tried to hint at things, like suggesting I look for better paying jobs or consider starting my own business, but I never seemed to get the message. I pointed out that there's a difference between discussing career goals together and complaining to another man about your husband's lack of ambition while accepting his money. She said she never meant for it to go that far. It just felt good to have someone listen without trying to talk her out of wanting better things. We went back and forth about what better things actually meant. She wanted a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood, luxury cars, expensive vacations, designer clothes. I asked her what was wrong with our current life that made these things necessary for her happiness. She said nothing was wrong with our life, but it wasn't the life she'd imagined having at this point. She said when she married me, she thought we'd both be more successful by now, making more money, living more comfortably. I asked her if she'd married me or married her expectations of what I might become. She couldn't answer that question directly, which told me everything I needed to know. The conversation took a turn when she started crying and saying she didn't want to lose me over something that could be fixed. She said she'd been spoiled by her family growing up and didn't know how to be satisfied with gradual progress instead of immediate gratification. She promised to stop comparing our life to other people's and to work on appreciating what we'd built together. She said she'd even consider moving somewhere cheaper so we could save money and reduce financial stress. For a moment, I almost believed we could work it out. Then she said something that changed everything. She said if I came home, she'd prove she could be happy with less, but she needed me to promise I'd work harder to advance my career so we could eventually have the lifestyle she really wanted. Even in her apology, she was still asking me to become someone else to make her happy. I told her I needed more time to think, which triggered a complete meltdown. She said I was dragging this out because I wanted to punish her, that I was being cruel by keeping her in limbo instead of just forgiving her and coming home. She said she'd already been humiliated enough by having to explain to her family why her husband moved out, and now people were going to think she was a terrible wife who drove away a good man. The fact that she was more worried about what people would think than about actually fixing our relationship problems told me where her priorities still were. My brother came out during this part of the conversation, and Bryn immediately switched tactics. She started asking him to talk sense into me, saying I was being stubborn and unrealistic about marriage requiring compromise from both people. My brother looked at me and said it sounded like the compromising had been pretty one-sided so far. He asked Bryn what she was planning to give up or change to meet me halfway. She said she'd already given up her friendship with Danny, which should be enough. She left after that, but not before saying I had 1 week to decide whether I wanted to save our marriage or throw it away over something that was already over. Sunday was quiet, but Monday morning the real drama started. June called me directly. Apparently, Bryn had told her family that I was threatening divorce over a harmless friendship, leaving out most of the details about the money and the months of emotional infidelity. June spent 20 minutes explaining how marriage requires forgiveness, and that I was being selfish by not working harder to provide the life Bryn deserved. She said young women today have options and expectations that previous generations didn't have, and that I needed to step up or risk losing a wonderful woman. I asked June if she thought it was appropriate for married women to accept money from other men while complaining about their husbands. She said that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that Bryn felt unsupported and unappreciated in our marriage. When I pointed out that Bryn had publicly humiliated me at Maeve's dinner party, June said that was just frustration boiling over, and I should look at why she was frustrated instead of holding grudges. The conversation ended when I told June that her daughter's happiness wasn't my responsibility if it required me to completely change who I am to achieve it. Maeve called Tuesday. She was slightly more reasonable than her mother, but still firmly on Bryn's side. She said marriages go through rough patches, and that divorcing over this would be an overreaction. She said Bryn had made a mistake, but she was willing to fix it, which showed maturity and commitment. I asked Maeve if she'd be okay with her husband accepting money from another woman while complaining about their marriage. She said that was different because her husband would never put her in that position in the first place. When I asked what she meant by that, she said her husband understood his role as a provider and worked hard to make sure she never felt like she needed to look elsewhere for support. So, according to Bryn's family, this was ultimately my fault for not being successful enough to prevent my wife from seeking financial and emotional support from another man. The most frustrating part is that they're all acting like I'm the unreasonable one for not immediately forgiving and forgetting everything that happened, like the public humiliation, the months of emotional cheating, and the fundamental disrespect were just minor bumps in the road that I should get over. I'm supposed to give Bryn my final answer by this weekend. She's been alternating between apologetic texts and angry ones, depending on which family member she's been talking to that day. Honestly, I think I already know what my answer is going to be. I just needed to work through all of this drama to be completely sure. Anyone else dealt with in-laws who think you should be grateful their daughter settled for you? Because this whole experience has shown me exactly what Bryn's family really thinks of me. And it's not pretty. Final update. Well, it's over. I gave Bryn my decision yesterday, and the fallout has been exactly what I expected, only worse. I spent the entire weekend thinking about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The dinner party, the therapy session, finding out about Danny, the conversations with her family. Every time I tried to imagine going back to our marriage, I kept coming back to the same problem. Bryn doesn't respect who I am. She respects who she thinks I could become if I worked harder, made more money, and prioritized her vision of success over my own values. But the person I actually am right now, today, isn't enough for her. That realization made the decision easy. I met Bryn at our house Sunday afternoon. She'd been staying there while I was at my brother's place, and honestly, it felt weird walking into what used to feel like home. She had flowers on the table and had made dinner, clearly hoping this was going to be a reconciliation meeting. I sat down and told her directly that I wanted a divorce. She went completely silent for about 30 seconds, then started crying and asking if this was really what I wanted or if her family had pushed me to this decision. I explained that her family's reaction had actually clarified things for me because it showed me how all of them really viewed our marriage. She said she'd been thinking all week about how to make things work, that she'd even looked into jobs that paid more, so she could contribute more financially and take pressure off me to earn more. She said she was ready to change and grow, that people could work on their problems if they both wanted to. I asked her what specific problems she thought she needed to work on. She said she needed to be more grateful for what we had, instead of always wanting more, and she needed to communicate better when she felt unsupported, instead of seeking that support outside our marriage. Those were the right answers, but they felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing what to say to get me to stay. I asked her if she genuinely believed she could be happy long-term with our current lifestyle, not just accepting it while working towards something better, but actually being satisfied with the house we had, the cars we drove, the vacations we could afford on our current income. She hesitated before answering, which told me everything I needed to know. She said she could learn to be happy with it if she knew we were working together toward eventually having more. Even in her promise to change, she was still asking me to commit to becoming someone different to meet her expectations. I told her I thought we wanted fundamentally different things out of life, and that wasn't something therapy could fix. She said that was exactly the kind of thinking that destroys marriages, that compromise and growth were what relationships were about. I asked her what she was willing to compromise on. She said she'd already compromised by cutting off Danny and being willing to stay in our current house longer than she'd planned. I pointed out that ending an inappropriate relationship wasn't a compromise. It was correcting a mistake. And staying in the house we already lived in wasn't a sacrifice, it was just accepting reality. She got angry then, saying I was being impossible to please, and that I was using her mistakes as an excuse to avoid working on our real problems. She said I was punishing her by holding Danny over her head instead of focusing on rebuilding our relationship. That's when I realized we were having completely different conversations. She saw this as a rough patch that we could overcome with effort and forgiveness. I saw it as a fundamental incompatibility that had been exposed by recent events but had probably been there all along. I told her I'd be filing for divorce this week. She said I was making the biggest mistake of my life and that I'd regret throwing away our marriage when I realized how good I'd had it. She said I'd never find another woman who loved me enough to put up with my lack of ambition and my contentment with mediocrity. That comment right there confirmed that I was making the right decision. I packed more of my stuff and left. She was still crying when I walked out, but she was also texting someone, probably calling for backup from her family. Sure enough, I started getting calls within an hour. June was first, and she was furious. She said I was throwing away a marriage to a wonderful woman over something that was already resolved. She said Bryn had made one mistake, and I was being vindictive and unforgiving. I told June that the mistake wasn't having an emotional affair. The mistake was marrying someone whose family convinced her she was settling for less than she deserved. June said that was ridiculous, that they'd always supported our marriage. I asked her if she'd ever once said anything positive about me to Bryn, or if every conversation was about how Bryn could do better. June got quiet, which was answer enough. She said parents want their children to have good lives, and there was nothing wrong with encouraging Bryn to have high standards and ambitions. I said there was when those standards required me to become someone else to meet them. June said I was being selfish by prioritizing my comfort over Bryn's happiness. I said I was being realistic about what I could provide and who I actually was. The call ended with June saying I'd destroyed her daughter's life and that she hoped I was proud of myself. Maeve called next, trying to play mediator. She said everyone was emotional and that maybe we should all take some time to cool down before making permanent decisions. She said divorce was expensive and complicated, and that most marital problems could be solved with better communication and compromise. I asked Maeve if she thought I should change careers, work more hours, and completely alter my lifestyle to make Bryn happy. She said marriage required sacrifice from both people, and that if Bryn was willing to work on her issues, I should be willing to work on mine. I asked what my issues were, according to her. She said I was too comfortable with where I was in life and not motivated enough to provide the security and lifestyle that wives need to feel valued. So even Maeve, who was trying to be reasonable, believed the fundamental problem was that I wasn't successful enough for Bryn. The calls continued all evening. Bryn herself called around 9, alternating between begging me to reconsider and accusing me of giving up without really trying to fix things. She said she'd scheduled more therapy sessions and that she was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild trust. She said she loved me and couldn't imagine being married to anyone else. I asked her if she loved me as I was right now, or if she loved the potential she saw in me. She said that wasn't a fair question because love meant wanting the best for each other and helping each other grow. I said that sounded like she loved who she thought I could become, not who I actually was. She said I was twisting her words and that of course she loved me, but she also believed in me enough to know I could achieve more if I tried. Even her declaration of love came with conditions and expectations for improvement. I filed for divorce Monday morning. My lawyer said the process should be straightforward since we don't have kids and our finances are relatively simple. The money Danny sent to Bryn could potentially complicate things, but probably won't since the amounts weren't huge and she's not fighting the divorce. Actually, she is fighting it, just not legally. She's been calling and texting constantly, trying to get me to agree to more therapy or at least a trial separation instead of jumping straight to divorce. She sent me a long message yesterday saying she'd talked to a counselor who told her that marriages often go through crisis periods that make them stronger if both people are committed to working through them. She said she was ready to do the work if I was, but she's still not understanding the basic problem. She keeps talking about working on our marriage like it's a project that needs improvement, when the real issue is that she fundamentally doesn't accept me as I am. The hardest part is that I do still care about her. 6 years of marriage doesn't just disappear because you realize you're incompatible. But caring about someone isn't the same as being able to build a life with them. Her family is telling everyone who will listen that I'm abandoning my marriage over a minor indiscretion, conveniently leaving out the parts about the public humiliation, the months of emotional infidelity, and their own role in making Bryn feel like she'd settled for less than she deserved by marrying me. My family and friends have been incredibly supportive, which has been a relief. My brother said he'd been worried about my marriage for longer than he'd let on, because he'd noticed how Bryn talked about our life like it was temporary, like she was waiting for something better to come along. My parents said they'd always liked Bryn, but had noticed that she seemed frustrated with me in ways that didn't make sense to them, since I'd always been responsible and hardworking. They said they were proud of me for standing up for myself and not letting anyone convince me I wasn't good enough. The weirdest part is how relieved I feel. I thought I'd be sadder about ending my marriage, but mostly I just feel free. Free from the constant pressure to want more, earn more, be more. Free from walking on eggshells around someone who saw my contentment as laziness and my satisfaction as lack of ambition. I'm staying with my brother for now while I look for my own place. It's strange starting over at 34, but it's also kind of exciting. I get to build a life based on what actually makes me happy, not what someone else thinks I should want. Bryn texted me this morning asking if I was really going through with this. She said she'd been thinking about everything that happened, and she realized she'd been influenced too much by outside opinions about what her life should look like. She said she wanted to try again, just the two of us, without input from family or friends. She said she thought she could learn to be happy with what we had if I'd give her the chance. It was probably the most honest thing she'd said through this whole process, but it was also too late. The fact that she had to learn to be happy with me said everything about why this marriage couldn't work. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but that I needed to be with someone who didn't have to convince themselves I was enough. She hasn't responded to that yet, but I'm sure I'll hear from her family again soon. For anyone following this story, thanks for all the support and advice. It helped me realize I wasn't crazy for thinking that love should include acceptance, not just potential for improvement. Sometimes the person you married changes, and sometimes you realize they were never who you thought they were in the first place. Either way, it's okay to admit when it's not working instead of spending your life trying to become someone else's idea of who you should be.